Welcome to our first CEO Roundtable of the day. Very excited about moderating these fine gentlemen here. This is a panel discussing the Net Neutrality Ruling, and we call it Unchartered Territory, and that's truly what it is. It's a topic that is constantly changing. Every morning I'm checking the headlines, what's the latest, this moment. So to be able, as a telecom event, to host you gentlemen to talk about this evolving and an important conversation, this topic, it's truly an honor. So thank you for joining us. And with us is farthest on the orange mic, we have Mr. Hunter Newby, CEO of Allied Fiber. Allied Fiber, if you're not aware, alliedfiber.com. Allied is building national open access network neutral dark fiber super infrastructure. And Hunter Newby is a communications network business and real estate investor and developer with a highly successful track record of creating value. He's been holding a senior role in over $600 million of transactions, as well as a published author, speaker, etc. So, Hunter.
Thank you.
We also have, in the middle, if you will, Steve Davis. He's the EVP of Public Policy and Government Relations of CenturyLink. You may know that CenturyLink is the third largest telecommunications company in the U.S. Steve is responsible for the development and advocacy of CenturyLink's regulatory and legislative policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Steve is also notably chairman of the board of the U.S. Telecom Association. And his 35 years of experience in federal, state, and local telecommunications law includes previously working at Qwest and AT&T. So, welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
And rounding out our panel, we have Dr. David Reed. He is a scholar in residence and associate faculty director in the interdisciplinary telecommunications program of University of Colorado at Boulder. He previously, Dr. Reed was also the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Strategy Officer at Cable Television Laboratories. Dr. Reed has also been a telecommunications policy analyst in the Office of Plans and Policy at the FCC, where he worked on cable telco competition, personal communication services, or PCS, and spectrum auction policies. So, welcome, Doctor.
Thank you.
So just to set the stage a little bit before we turn it over to our fine panelists, we have a battle right now going on for the open internet. And it's now entering into a new phase. What we have on one side are the federal regulators and content providers trying to preserve competition and keep all websites equally accessible. And on the other side, we've got internet service providers wanting to hold down those costs while keeping up with America's ever-increasing demand for digital content. So with that, are these goals mutually exclusive? What side is victorious, will be victorious? It's all a bit of a question mark these days. And the FCC, they faced a big setback on this front in January. As you remember, that when a court struck down its open internet rules, the FCC has barred ISPs from blocking of unreasonably discriminating against web content. But Verizon successfully challenged the regulations on the ground of its so-called net neutrality rules, which has overstepped the Commission's legal authority. So bringing us up to today, we have the FCC now facing the challenge of crafting new net neutrality regulations that will hopefully withstand legal scrutiny. So with that comes the question, first off, it seems a bit muddled, this whole net neutrality definition. So to you, panelists, how do you define net neutrality and the recent rulings? Hunter, did you want to start, and we'll just go down the line?
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for everybody coming out. Yeah, so there's two components to net neutrality. The first, the legal side, and the definition of net in net neutrality, and then there's the actual physical implementation of interconnection. And it's really no different than the consent decree itself, and exactly how open networks were opened It wasn't a legal document that opened the network, it was physical interconnection that took place. So briefly, the net and net neutrality refers to network specifically, not the internet, although on Wiki you'll see that it says both. And if you know anything about the OSI model and the 7 layers, you'll know that network at layers 1 and 2 is completely different than IP at 3 and the internet, which is a series of IP networks. So what net neutrality to me means is not about the internet, it's about access to the internet. And you can see that clearly in the Comcast Netflix deal, where unfortunately Cogent, as an ISP, was cut out of the middle of managing that relationship, because Comcast owns the physical facilities to the endpoints. So they control access. And the content provider, in that instance Netflix, needed to go directly to that last mile provider in order to ensure the quality of their connection. It has nothing to do with the internet. The internet does not exist in the Comcast Netflix relationship. It is an IP to IP network interface. So that's on the one side. And on the other side, as Jamie touched on, and this is really important, the court shot down not net neutrality rules, not the fact that net neutrality rules should exist. The court deemed that the FCC did not have the authority to create or enforce those rules. So the FCC was taken out of the equation. And now there basically is no entity that exists that has the authority to create or enforce the rules, or not create, but enforce the rules that are already there in place. There's no entity. It's the Wild West. So that's a little scary. So just to sort of frame it, that's my definition, and I think that's what just occurred relative to the court overturning the FCC's authority on net neutrality.
And Steve, do you agree with his Wild West description?
I'd have to disagree with some of it. Again, thank you also for having me here, and thanks everybody for being up here. Let me say that I look at net neutrality a little bit differently, and I look at it more in the context of the way in which the FCC has examined net neutrality and defined net neutrality, and the way the FCC's rules address net neutrality. And I think it's comprised of 2 principal components. One is assuring that ISPs don't deny access to lawful content or degrade access to lawful content. Now, I don't know of any ISPs that do that, and I think that was part of the original rules or principles that FCC Commissioner Powell announced probably 8 or 10 years ago. But the concept of not denying access or degrading access to lawful content is one principle, and I think all companies generally would agree with that principle. The second principle has to do with whether or not all the costs associated with creation of the internet, creation of the networks that comprise the internet, whether those costs must be borne by end users, or whether those costs can also be attributed to a Netflix or a Google or a Yahoo or the edge providers, the content providers. And that's been the critical sticking point on the disagreement with respect to net neutrality at the FCC. Can Google go out, can Netflix go out and buy superior access to their end users versus that which is generally made available by Comcast or by us, to other customers? And a couple of things with respect to the court ruling. One, I think the winner in the court ruling was the FCC, because the court found the FCC has jurisdiction to deal with these matters. It just can't deal with them in the manner in which it did. And so the FCC can adopt rules under Section 706 or under Section 201. So it can deem this a common carrier service, it can adopt rules under 706, and that's what Chairman Wheeler has indicated the FCC is going to look at. They're going to decide the extent to which additional regulations are necessary. But I think that the key question on net neutrality is whether or not there's a two-sided market, whether or not an ISP, CenturyLink, can sell access to customers at $20 for 5 megabits, a month, and also sell access to Google or Netflix or high-capacity users who want to obtain those higher quality connections, or faster connections, probably is a better term. other interesting point that Hunter raised is the Comcast Netflix agreement, which has recently been announced. Now, what's interesting is that Comcast remains subject to the net neutrality rules. So the rules the FCC adopted that were vacated by the court still apply to Comcast as a result of its acquisition of NBC, a year and a half ago. So those rules apply to Comcast. So the Comcast Netflix agreement is, at least in their view, and in my view, I suppose, compliant with the net neutrality rules that were vacated by the court.
And Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, as well. My views here are my own. I'm not representing anybody. Just want to let folks know I'm just the academic up the road here. So you can see, this just with Jamie's question, we flounder around a little bit on exactly what net neutrality means and represents. I agree with a lot of what's been said here, but in part that is, I think, implicit in what net neutrality was from the beginning. It really didn't have specific things that it was targeting to fix, and it's been trying to address some concerns without a lot of necessarily specifics associated with them. But I do agree with what Steve was saying, that going forward, and you look at what net neutrality is, the real battleground here is around this two-sided market and the notion of whether, for example, with what AT&T announced at CES with the sponsored data, is that a violation of net neutrality, specifically within the transparency and the non-discrimination and the blocking rules, or not? And before the court overturned all this, the new chairman, Tom Wheeler, seemed to say, well, let's wait and see what happens once AT&T announced that sponsored data plan, which is the two-sided approach. And what that means is that can the ISPs, can they charge both residential customers for the broadband service as well as the edge providers? So that's the two-sided market notion here. And you know, the research on this is still out. There hasn't been a study that has shown in a highly conclusive manner whether there's a concern or not that needs to be addressed with regard to market power. Some of the analysis will basically show that if you have something, a market power in the terminating access part of the market, under some set of parameters, net neutrality enhances consumer welfare. But it also can create some parameters and set of conditions that it doesn't. And so, you know, I think that's in part why you've seen the commission, with where they're going, has said we're going to do this on a case-by-case basis a bit, because some of these conditions are going to be different than others. And so we don't really have in the big picture, in summarizing, I don't think we have a good definition of net neutrality because we don't quite understand all the problems. And maybe down the road we'll talk a little bit about this cogent issue, because I don't think that's net neutrality, but we'll.
Well, we're here in a sports arena, right? So let's look at the scorecard. Who are the winners, who are the losers? And in your opinion, knowing that opinions are varied on our panel, which I like. So Steve, do you want to start us off in your opinion?
Okay, first I think consumers are the winners, because I believe that we have a risk under the rule that all costs of building the internet must be paid by end users. I think there's a risk that we end up with haves and have-nots, and we already are to some extent, among end users. Those who can afford to buy a gigabit to their house, or can afford to buy 40 megabits or 80 megabits to their house, are getting tremendous amounts of speed, and as capacity constraints might be forced into place, greater ability to access capacity and obtain all the content they wish to obtain, while as those who aren't willing or lack the ability to pay, for 40 megabits or 80 megabits or a gigabit to their house, are left with lower speeds and with maybe data limitations as plans like the wireless plans, become more prevalent. And so I think that a two-sided market is of value to consumers because it spreads the cost, and those that are causing significant cost in the internet, the Netflixes of the world, have the opportunity to assure greater access to their customers and at the same time cover some of the costs of the billions of dollars that are invested in building the internet just in this country every single year. So I think consumers win. I also think regulators win, because as I said, the FCC did not appeal this decision. And the reason it didn't appeal this decision was because the court agreed that Section 706 of the Act gave them independent authority to impose certain regulations on the internet. It also recognized the right under Section 201. So the FCC has the ability to manage the internet and manage access to it, manage net neutrality in a way that fosters the greatest level of consumer benefit. So that's what I'd say are the winners.
All right, and Dr. David?
Well, so, I would say, at least on the surface, you'd also have to say that the large ISPs are winners, because they're, particularly Verizon was the one that, brought the case, and in essence, the outcome is what they're looking for. Now, is it exactly did the court exactly decide what Verizon would want? Well, we don't know. So with that, then you're left with, with Steve, my definition, everybody's a winner. So I'm not sure we can go that far. To be honest, I don't think we know. And in terms of who wins and loses out of this, I agree the FCC could win if they clean up their approach on net neutrality, if they use this as an example, because the courts smacked it back to say, get your house in order in terms of how you are regulating these services. If you're going to regulate it as a common carrier, call it as a common carrier. If it's through Section 706, how far can you go on your non-discrimination, and have the courts test it, and that could eventually be a win, because they get it. They get a solution that's going to work. The consumer, I don't think the consumer is really going to be. I'd say it's neutral right now, because most of the large ISPs have said, while this is happening, they're not going to change things very much. Now, that's with the qualifier. We've got this sponsored data, and if other ISPs, if CenturyLink comes out with their own kind of sponsored data, we don't know how this market's going to evolve. And the sponsored data approach is that with your smartphone, you basically can use some apps that, if it's a Netflix app as an example, and this is not there's not a business agreement right now between Netflix and AT&T, but Netflix has purchased some data from AT&T so that when I use Netflix on my smartphone, it doesn't count against my usage cap. And is that good or bad? We really don't know what in the long term the trends will be. If all applications migrate to a sponsored data plan, well, that could be a potential downside, because if you're a small startup, how do you have enough money to pay all the ISPs that, or have sponsored data plans? It's a lot of transaction costs. That could be potentially something that harms innovation, or it might evolve in a way that it's very easy and simple, and people like that. People like the broadcast model. People like things that are free. They like ad-sponsored models. Does this evolve in that type of a way? And the two-sided market is not very, doesn't impinge upon the consumers. We don't really know yet, but it's certainly going to be something that's followed quite closely.
Hunter?
I think it would be useful to frame this one step further from what I said originally, and bifurcate consumers from everything else, which I'll just call network operators. Okay? So this whole discussion that we're having right now is centered on consumers. Consumers are hostages, and the service providers are telling you in their benevolent way that this is the best internet for you, and we decide. Because consumers don't really have a choice. Because individuals cannot go out and build their own mobile phone and create a whole network in a spectrum that's licensed and build all this infrastructure just so that they can have a mobile device. They also can't build all the infrastructure from their home all the way back to a peering point to build their own internet, because they can't. They can't afford to. Consumers are hostages, and they're told, this is the quality of the food that you're going to eat, and you're going to smile, and you're going to pay me for it. Now let's talk about the network operators. Independent network operators okay, are the winners here. Anyone that has or can secure rights of way and build their own infrastructure, fiber, and light it, can bypass all of this entire discussion. It does not apply to them. And this is not new, okay? I come out of the international wholesale voice world. You ever heard of a white route and a gray route? A leaky PBX? People know what that is. I mean, the old circuit switch TDM voice days are kind of gone. But this all happened already. There used to be days when there was just PTTs and international settlement agreements. And then there was DREG and Carter phone and a lot of other things that happened in the hardware world. And people built routes to bypass the incumbents so that they could basically lower their costs, and bypass took place physically in buildings known as carrier hotels that were born out of the necessity to interconnect around the incumbent and their laws and rules and pricing. And that drove an entire industry of thousands of networks to be born, because no one could afford to pay $1 a minute or $2 a minute or whatever. And the bottom dropped out of the whole circuit switch voice world very quickly. It was a race to the bottom. And thank God IP came along and saved the day and made everything flat rate. And then the whole voice world just became an app, and it disappeared. And nobody even tracks it anymore. But the essence of network operators being able to find those common points on planet Earth to put their own equipment and directly connect to other networks was the basis upon which no neutral rules necessarily applied, because they could do something about it. Consumers can't. So let's just talk about net neutrality in those two very clear, distinct ways. When a network owns the last mile, whether it's mobile or fixed line, they're the ones that the content providers have to go negotiate with. So I don't care what the net neutrality rules are, and I don't care if the FCC has the authority to enforce them or not. If a Netflix has to go sit at the table and cut a deal directly with Comcast, that supersedes net neutrality rules. And it's a bilateral peering relationship with certain economic terms that are not disclosed publicly. And like Dr. David Reed here just said, now think about the internet. It's a multilateral relationship. Once you're on it, there's a set of rules. And now there's, well, who's paying for what and which side, and basically who can I corner and say, you have to come through me to go to here, so you must make a deal with me. So the multilateral nature of the best efforts internet, which people have come to rely on, all of a sudden becomes the old wholesale circuit switch, got to sit down and do 1,000 bilats with people. And who's got the time for that? Who's got the money for that? So if you're an app developer and you just want to throw your app out on iTunes to get out to the world, you better hope Apple has done all that bilateral relationship stuff already, or else the quality of the delivery of your product to the end user is going to be impacted. And that's something that people never had to think about before.
So can I jump in a little bit
sure.
here? Because I agree on your point, by the way, on
Hostages.
Well, on more, if you can get entry.
That's a strong word. You know, I'm just trying to get people to understand.
I agree on the point on entry on fiber to the home and Google Fiber, and that's kind of an interesting topic. But on the point, I guess what I mentioned earlier, I don't think the Netflix Comcast agreement is a net neutrality issue, and you see that often. That it's the end of net neutrality, that Comcast and Netflix came to an agreement. And that I disagree with. For what Hunter's talking about, and the way you put it, it's not about the internet in that agreement. Netflix has, over time, developed their own content distribution network and capability. They relied on third-party providers to do that for a while, Akamai and Cogent. At some point in time, when you're developing your own, you make a lease versus we're going to do this our own agreement, and that's going to be a function of where your traffic's going and how you're going to interconnect and the like. With regard to the agreement with Comcast and where the outrage has been that I've read in some of the different articles, and which I think is misplaced, is they're shocked that now Netflix is gonna pay Comcast for the peering. Well, I'm sure most of you who have done any peering know there are paid peering agreements before this occurred. And in particular, when the asymmetry got above 2 to 2.5, a lot of the peering policies of different ISPs are to say, we gotta talk about this, because this bill and keep isn't working anymore. And so, with regard to Netflix, they are clearly asymmetric, and that ratio is going to be above 2.5 to 1. And so that negotiation with Comcast makes a lot of sense. Now, when you read the details of it, that, again, this is all under NDA for the folks, I haven't seen the agreement, I don't know if anybody here has, that have been leaked out. You hear that Netflix got a multi-year agreement, and the agreement was on the order of millions of dollars. Not hundreds of millions, and this is the traffic provider that is 30% of the traffic. So at least some of the stuff that's been leaked out is there is not, this wasn't a huge transfer of wealth for what Netflix has created to Comcast, because they have a market power in the access portion of the network. That being said, and I agree with Hunter, that is something that needs to be watched. To the extent to which there is not significant competition on the access part of the network, and there is a lot of leverage by one provider, that is something to watch, because through these peering agreements, they might be able to leverage and get additional rents because of that market power. But, here, for example, in the Denver area, you've got Comcast. CenturyLink has got a DSL technology. They're saying they're going to be investing in higher speed technologies that'll up the speed on the broadband. Hopefully we get the competition, or Google Fiber or somebody, and that mitigates that. But that's a point with regard to Comcast and Netflix on peering. It's not net neutrality in the sense that Comcast is somehow throttling Netflix traffic, or there's discrimination or blocking issue. And so that's why I make the case, this isn't a net neutrality issue, it's a peering question.
And I think the question around even the Comcast-Netflix agreement is, but at the end of the day, who should be paying for the internet? Who should it be, and in what manner? So, Steve, would you like to?
Well, I think at the end of the day, customers pay for the internet. I mean, the communications industry invested $25 billion last year in internet infrastructure. So it all gets to customers in one way or another, of one company or another. The question, I think, is which customers pay for the internet. So obviously, customers who subscribe to Comcast Internet Access Service or our Internet Access Service, they're paying a lot of the cost of the internet. But there's also the opportunity for other entities, the ones, 30% of the traffic in prime time is Netflix traffic. So 30% of the peak load is Netflix. So the question is, should the customers who watch Netflix movies, and Netflix and its customers, pay some portion of those costs that are being put on the internet? And that's the question. But at the end of the day, let's face it, customers are going to pay for it. It's just a question of whether you attribute some of the costs to what you consider the cost causers, those that are causing that peak demand. And so I think there's value in the two-sided market. I think there's value in getting costs more allocated to cost causers. I do want to respond to the hostage question, because I don't think that's a fair analogy. I think that customers are always a hostage of, if you want to use that term, of the provider of the good or service they want to purchase. I mean, they're no more hostage of internet service as they are wireless service or cable TV service, or what show, HBO is going to put on at 7 o'clock tonight. So, at some point, yeah, I guess, but it's a pretty strained analogy. And I do think that when we get into questions about the interconnection between between network owners, peering versus transit agreements, that's not net neutrality. That's an interesting topic, but it's a different topic.
Hunter?
Not for or against. Everybody has to pay for infrastructure. My point was that the term hostage brings to mind, elicits certain visions and pictures. So that's okay. At the end of the day, network operators, like a content provider, for example, or a social media company or an internet search company or something. They don't have to buy transit. They could build their own network and they can peer it all off. And there happens to be one really big internet search engine company with some pretty smart people that they hired a decade ago or more that knew this. And they went and they built their own network. And they freaked a lot of people out when they did it because they couldn't be stopped. They essentially built their own internet. And they created the rules upon which people would connect and peer with them. They turned it around and they cut the ISP out of the middle and they peered off, not 100% because that's kind of impossible, but damn near as much as they could. Because they could go around. End users can't go around. You're going to pick from one of a handful of mobile operators and that's it, because the United States is a big country and it costs a lot of money. I know, I'm building a big network, it costs a lot of money. So end users don't have choice. Yeah, they have choice. It's an optical illusion that they have choice. They have a few people that they have to pick from that are all sort of kind of close in the same price range and are all saying the same sort of things about both sides are going to pay. But if you go to the network operators, which again, I think the network operator was the winner in this whole situation, because whether you call it peering or net neutrality or whatever, it's about control. This is all about control. Who has control? And whoever has control makes the rules. And if someone is sitting in front of you saying, I have control, and they're telling you what the rules are and you don't like them, and you can go around them, they don't actually have control. And that's where the network operators, the independents, who could go out and get their own fiber and light it and buy equipment from one of the many hardware vendors and go find a neutral interconnection point and get a rack and set up their stuff and cross-connect. They don't have to be told what the rules are. They could go make their own rules. And that's what I was talking about.
I'd just like to take a moment and just ask the audience, does anyone have any questions? I want this to be a round table. I want you to feel like you can interject and get your own question out there to our panel of experts. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
Hunter and David both mentioned cogent, and I don't understand the cogent play or issue in the Comcast Time Warner merger. What happened to cogent? Or
It wasn't Comcast Time Warner, it was the Netflix Comcast deal. So Netflix was buying transit from Cogent, and Cogent was delivering Netflix bits to the Comcast network. And Netflix is 30% of the internet. Comcast knows, they do deep packet inspection, and they're like, hey, wait a second. Cogent has a relationship with us as a network operator, as a peer. It's unfair that Cogent will be charging Netflix for something that they're peering off to us. So all of a sudden Netflix didn't work real well on ultimately the Comcast network, the end users. There was a lot of calls and whatnot. And Cogent in the middle couldn't do anything about it because they were just passing the bit from one side to the other. It was the Comcast network that was the terminus. And that precipitated a direct relationship between Netflix and Comcast for that portion of the Netflix traffic. They still use Cogent to do other things, distribution, CDN type stuff, and also just, public routing table, transit, the whole internet, but not the Comcast part of the internet. That has now dropped out of the internet and become a bilateral physical layer direct interconnect with, a certain set of economic terms that were millions of dollars, but as far as I'm concerned, was a precedent. Not that peering hasn't been going on forever, and paid peering has been going on forever, and people are making a big deal out of something that's been going on for, as far as I know, 15 years. But anyway, Cogent as an ISP in that scenario, as a middleman, got cut out. That's what happened.
But I don't necessarily disagree. I just say that generally speaking, under peering arrangements, traffic is theoretically somewhat in balance. And so if Cogent is sending 14 billion bits of information to Comcast, it is also receiving 14 billion bits back. And so the theory is, well, if we're both sending each other about the same amount of traffic, why are we billing each other? Let's just call it even. And that's the whole peering concept. And the concept for the history of the internet, so far as I know, has been then when that peering relationship is out of balance, when Cogent is sending massive amounts of data to Comcast, but getting no data back from Comcast in return, or very little, then it goes to a transit or a paid arrangement as opposed to free termination of all those data. And that was the dispute. Cogent did not want to pay for the peering, for the transit of information to Comcast. And so Netflix stepped in and essentially arranged some type of arrangement, which I haven't seen, so I don't know what kind of arrangement they reached, but it was an arrangement to terminate that traffic in an imbalanced situation such that peering was no longer appropriate.
So we're in one other, and here I'm speaking without facts. So,
Wait, is that a requirement?
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody told me about that.
But there's a general trend, and I don't know how much it specifically applies within Cogent, of the edge providers, the big edge providers like Google, Amazon, and Netflix, to be developing their own content distribution networks out over time. More and more infrastructure. And they initially start relying on a lot of third-party providers. But as you build out more of your own, there's a natural evolution. Whether or not, you know, the timing for Cogent not being part of the distribution chain for Netflix, I don't know. But in general, as these large edge providers grow out, they are putting more and more of their own infrastructure in place. And that also has implications down the road on sponsored data plans. I mean, because these are very big players. And again, that's why I say we gotta watch how this evolves over time so that there's not the concerns that the FCC had on net neutrality on the two-sided markets and the non-discrimination issues that net neutrality has on that.
I just want to get to the question in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, it looks as if the rules and regulations aren't sort of keeping up with how the market's moving. So if you take a step back and you look internationally, what other best practices have you seen in other countries or some other governance that sort of kept up with the market and maybe provided the applicable level of guidance?
You know, I can comment a little bit because we keep up, we watch what's happening in other countries, the EU and Asia Pacific. In so many countries, the internet infrastructure is owned by the government or a government-sponsored monopoly, such that you know they're establishing policies for one entity. And so a lot of the EU analysis has been, so how is net neutrality working in America, and trying to look at whether or not, you know, to impose similar types of requirements, but I don't know of anything that's particularly you'd say, wow, that's a model that really works. The other thing I will say is, insofar as keeping up, it's so difficult for, you know, regulations to keep up with, you know, we paid for the Spanish-American War for like 75 years, you know, and so the ability to adopt a set of rules and expect it to stay up with the internet is really kind of farcical. Going back to David's point about the small guy, the guy who's starting a content business in a garage, and how does he compete with Google if there's not net neutrality? Well, the fact of the matter is that Google or Netflix or the big guys, whoever they are, Amazon, they're gonna find ways to get their data to their end users one way or another. They're gonna build private content delivery networks. They're going to put servers geographically dispersed around the country so that the ability of customers to get to their data quickly is enhanced, whether you call it net neutrality or whether you trying to restrict the ability of those entities to get content to their end users is just doomed from the very beginning. The question is, how are you going to manage that occurrence?
Yes.
I had a question for Steve. Does CenturyLink have a paid peering product similar to what Comcast offers?
What we have, it's not so much a product as we peer with many different entities. I can't give you the number, with many. But to the extent there's an imbalance of traffic, then transit agreements are reached, where there's some kind of compensation for an entity that sends massive amounts of data to for termination, and that's no different than AT&T or Comcast or any others.
And are you offering this directly to the content providers or only to other network operators?
I believe it would be both. I'd have to.
You guys are tier one?
We're tier one.
Yeah, so the, I don't know if it's different, but most of the peering policies of tier ones are, don't ask. We don't peer, we only do transit. That's kind of been for a while, but.
You mean new peering partners as
Yeah.
opposed to the existing
Yeah.
tier one peering partners?
Yeah, the tier ones. you got-
Transit.
Yeah.
Terminate transit agreements.
Right,
So
so
it's
transit is paid,
agreements.
and so you can always, with most tier ones, you can negotiate transit agreements, typically not peer one bill and keep type of agreements.
Yeah, but typically those transit agreements are all routes, whereas with Comcast, their paid peering is only to their routes, only to their eyeballs.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a significant differentiation.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, but, I mean, the tier one, they have a substantial backbone network throughout the country, right?
Right.
So you guys can cover by the definition of tier one is they give you access to the internet, right?
And to end users.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the concept that I think Hunter brought up of throttling.
Mhm.
We can argue whether they really did throttle or didn't throttle, and for throttle, I think we're saying that they make it so that your Netflix didn't work as well. Certainly, a lot of customers felt that they were doing that. I don't know whether they were or they weren't. But when I think of net neutrality, I think of that at the heart of the issue.
Right.
Can the last mile provider, can a Comcast or a Verizon or any other large ISP, when we get wireless, it's gonna be the same thing, can they throttle to get market advantage? And when I think of the case, I think of the case as saying, kinda, yeah, they can throttle, whether they did it or not, to get market advantage and thereby cut out the middleman, and it's just a distribution channel, cut out the middleman and say, I'm gonna go direct. And I think a lot of consumer advocate groups have been arguing for a long time, no, you can't throttle. What do you guys think?
It's pretty clear that the FCC and the court overturning their ability to enforce, it made it very clear that, you know, the golden rule. Got the gold, they make the rules. So it says, now, it is allowed that you can discriminate and you can block.
That's
Discriminate.
throttling.
Yeah, that's called throttling.
Yeah.
Discrimination is legal. I mean, that's such a 180, go call Al Sharpton and get him down here. Discrimination's legal. I'd say, what? Yeah, it's legal. And we could charge whatever we want, and you gotta come to us and make the deal. And yeah, so did they or didn't they? Why would they want the right to do it? Why would they want, well, right, but if they weren't doing it, and it was, the timing was interesting, we didn't really talk about this at all. The timing of the court overturning the FCC net neutrality rules, again, not overturning the rules, making it clear that they didn't have the authority to create or enforce. And then the Comcast Netflix deal was announced within a week. What do you think, Rich? You think customers were having a hard time getting the
I think
bids?
Customers were clearly having a hard time.
So, I don't know.
By the way, now you've got
That's okay.
Verizon customers, and again, it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, if
Is
you've
what
got a
it
lot of
is.
customers, maybe you should be able to.
Is
fly.
what it is.
You know,
Is
I
what
do
it
both
is.
sides, but if, you know, if you now have Verizon, and some Verizon customers think they're being throttled today because they, you know, got the same issue.
But there's
they
no-
don't have the market capacity, and that gets into your Time Warner cable, Comcast cable merger that I think everyone is concluding is not anti-competitive from a cable standpoint because they don't compete. But it gives them an incredible amount of market power that would allow them to cut a better deal if they're allowed to throttle.
Listen, it's, last point on this, it's not that they shouldn't be allowed to charge both sides or whatever. It's that there's no police department anymore.
Here's, if I could just, and gosh, I wish you wouldn't put me in a position of defending Comcast. I really, I really resent
Come on, we're
that.
trying. Yeah, the camera's off.
Uh-oh,
Quick.
But
I hope the
seriously-
air conditioner doesn't come on again. I want to hear this.
But seriously, what I would say is that I don't know of a single practice or function or service that was in practice before the FCC adopted net neutrality rules, that was stopped because of those rules, or one that didn't exist during those rules and exists today. I don't know of one thing that has occurred that was okay and is now not okay, or was then not okay, or everything not okay and then okay. The Comcast Netflix deal has nothing to do with net neutrality. The Comcast Netflix deal, Comcast is still subject to the net neutrality rules. They agreed to be subject to them. So,
For a period of time.
well, but today,
Yeah.
they are subject to those rules. So those rules and this agreement are not in conflict. Now, whether you like the concept appearing in transit agreements or don't, whether you think the internet needs more regulation or don't, the fact is that it's done pretty well with this amalgam of networks and edge providers and ISPs for 25 years with very, very little government regulation. And the other thing I would say is that the important aspect of this court decision was the FCC does have jurisdiction. The rules it adopted and the way it adopted them, they were vacated. But the court said, FCC, you have jurisdiction. You just need to decide how to exercise it and do it in a way that complies with those laws.
So I was, in your comments, I was looking into what was going on with Verizon, and there were some accusations about their, Netflix being throttled or blocked, and that the individual did that, and then the was he working? I don't know if it was a small ISP or what outfit he was associated with. They had a whole bunch of other people do a bunch of tests. And they came back and were not able to identify any throttling or blocking that would violate the net neutrality rules. They had a huge number of individuals who jumped on and were doing ping tests to try to figure out. You had Netflix come out and say, no, nobody's throttling us here. But what's worth noting there is that is part of at least the old net neutrality rules and the transparency that can continue on. And the notion of the transparency is that the ISP has to be very clear about their network management processes. I think this is an example of how that's a good thing, in that there are people watching. And the transparency rules are specifically designed so that if a company is doing something that's different than what they say on their website for network management, they're going to violate the rules.
So are they allowed to throttle, or they're not allowed to throttle, or can they only throttle if they tell us they're going to throttle?
So, I mean, take it literally without any of the, there are some some merger agreements like with Comcast, but there are other ISPs out there that if they wanted to, the net neutrality rules have been overturned, they could choose to do something different.
And that leads us into, what is enforceable, if anything? Like what was, Hunt is shaking his head, no, nothing, forget it.
You're subject to this if you're subject to it at the physical layer. And it's like a mystery. Madison River, Vonage, that's how far back I can think of this going with packets. Well, what do you mean? Vonage they're selling voice service over our internet connection, competing with our voice service? Oh, stop that. Block that. Deep packet, yeah, oh, it's all crackly, packets draw, packet loss. Well, wait a second, you can't do that. Well, why not? We control the pipe. We could do it. No, you can't do it. It's not fair. Well, now what's fair? I spent all the money to build a network and I want to make it back on high margin voice services, and now this guy's got some app that works over the internet that takes away my ability to sell the home user this voice service that I want to make 99% margin on. What side of that do you want to be on? Who, what? The internet, who, what? The capitalist, what? Who built it, who runs it? Am I the startup guy? And then you're like, okay, where's the police department? Bring them in here. Where are the sirens and the lights? Who's getting locked up? You know, lawyers and if I was Netflix and I was getting asked, is Verizon messing with the circuit and whatever? You know, that's like getting interviewed, right? You're the prisoner, you're getting interviewed. The warden's sitting there and they're asking you, how's the food? You know, and it's like, okay, I love it. You know, it's great. What are you supposed to say? He's like, I'm gonna cut a deal, all right? And I want this to work because I'm trying to run a business. And I know my margins are gonna be impacted, but it's better than I said you did it, you said that you didn't, and now we're gonna get into this long drawn out thing where, who knows? When you looked at it, I took a snapshot, didn't look like anything was happening at that moment. Okay, how is it enforceable? How is it? It's the internet, it's packets. It could be 100 reasons why it didn't work. I could say it was your router. You could say it was my router. I've seen this before, happened all the time, so.
Doesn't it all come back to that $9 a month though? So Netflix wants to charge you $9 a month for all you can eat, and that's pretty cheap, right? It's a great deal.
The cable companies look at it the same way that Madison River looked at Vonage.
Well, I guess, I mean, you look at Madison River and say, wow, that was a great success, because Madison River said, Vonage, you can't be on our network, and the FCC said, you're wrong, and so far as I know, that issue was resolved one time and forever, and it hasn't arisen again. So I look at Madison River and say, that worked out the way it should have worked out, and everything worked. I look at, you know, to the extent you looked at internet as opposed to voice, you know, there have been a couple of examples. There's Comcast, who had the issue, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago? I can't remember who it was. Anyway, you guys would remember. But you know, that issue came up, but it was addressed relatively quickly. It ended up in a lawsuit and everything else. But the practice was identified very quickly and stopped. And so, when you talk about throttling, I just don't know of any internet company that would intentionally throttle. I think you've got to define it. You got to find, are you intentionally narrowing down the flow of traffic, or is that entity not willing to buy facilities that will interconnect with you at the capacity they're sending to you? And those are different issues.
That's a legal way of defining it. I haven't invested in upgrading my equipment on the routers for the public peering sessions.
Well, if you haven't, you haven't.
We didn't have that in our budget. We didn't do it this year. So, well, let me get this straight.
No, I don't mean if Comcast had it in their budget. I mean if
Anybody.
Cogent had it in their budget.
Oh, well,
right?
that's
If
a different
Cogent-
story.
Exactly.
I was talking about Comcast. I remember when YouTube, before Google acquired YouTube, did a private peering with Comcast in LA at 600 West 7th Street. I remember it like it was yesterday. They ordered 4 10-gig waves, 4 cross connects into Comcast. Comcast's entire network at the time was 40 gig. And YouTube ordered 40 gig. And they were like, you know, we're talking about doing a jumper. And they were like, that's our entire network. And YouTube's like, listen, you don't get it. We have these public internet ISP things, and the video's not getting to your network. So we got to first of all get the ISP out of the way, and we need a direct pipe to you guys. They're like, no, you don't get it. That's our entire backbone. If you connect to us at 40 gig, there is nothing else. So then YouTube said, well, you better upgrade your network. And they go, well, to what? That's going to cost us a lot of money. Well, there's all this video, and you know your customers want to see it, so you have to pay the money for the upgrades. I mean, this is like 8 years ago. And I remember looking at their faces, and they were completely baffled that this was even happening. So now you come forward, and they say, who's responsible for paying for the upgrade? And they could say, well, we think you are. And as long as the content guys continue to get what they want, nothing will change. So they let the public peering ports on the routers get overloaded to the point where the guy making money on the content side says, hey, your service stinks. And they go, well, there's a way to fix that. You pay for the equipment that'll direct connect into us, and we'll buy it and install it. And that's this.
Yeah.
And by the way, I personally think that is network neutrality, and it's also peering. And these worlds have now intersected. And the whole rest of the world that used to not even know anything about the peering community in Nanog and Ripe and Apricot, it's on the front page of the Journal now and the Times, and it matters to people, and they're starting to learn about what the economics of the internet actually are.
So if I could say, here's, I like.
Just one more minute.
Yeah, one quick, and this is, whenever I do strategic reports, I like to put in a things to watch at the end, right?
Yeah.
A thing to watch here, we just had the Disney Dish agreement, and Disney, for the first time, gave streaming rights for Dish for the creation of a virtual MSO, over-the-top cable service with good content, ESPN and ABC and some of the top flight content. How does that, things to watch there is, as Dish rolls out this virtual MSO and as others get similar types of rights, how is that traffic, because it'll be a lot. Remember, we watch video, the average household, over 40 hours a week. Okay, it's a lot. So the pipe is going to get a lot of compression. You've got these sponsored data plans and the need to augment capacity. Let's watch how things play out. And that is related to the Madison River issue, so to speak. I would never believe an ISP would deliberately block. I agree with Steve that they would deliberately block those packets. On the other hand, are they managing those pipes in a responsible way?
Last comment, Jason?
Just a quick follow-on comment to what was said. Remember, there are some ISPs out there today, across the country, like GoGo, that are blocking and telling you, you can't watch streaming. You're not allowed to use Netflix, and they get away with it. And it's, call it a special app or whatever, but people in their minds are starting to know that, hey, if I subscribe and I pay GoGo, $10, I'm not allowed to use those things. I can look at anything else on the web, but if I want to go Netflix, off limits.
It's a great point, and that exists in more ways than one that you can't possibly even imagine. When Time Warner Cable didn't have the Knicks, and Jeremy Lin was breaking records, that brought them to their knees, that they had to pick it up and pay MSG the fee. And I mean, that's content on a network, and it was like, well, you want to call it net neutrality, I don't know what you want to call it, but there was a fight over money, and somebody was blocking the consumer hostage, saying you can't watch the Knicks, and people were going insane. And they, came to a head. It was like, you're gonna pay the VIG or else Manhattan's gonna come rip your arms out because they can't see Jeremy Lin and the Knicks. That goes on. I could never think of a network that would ever block all the time.
Well, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time, but this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate your passion and your words, your insight.